Hello, everybody.
Hello, Jan.
Hi, Randall, where are you?
I'm at home.
I'm
Hello.
look, I'm looking to see your face. Oh, there you are. Hi.
Hi.
This is Ruth Lanius. Ruth, this
Hi.
is Randall. Randall's the executive director of the Polyvagal Institute.
We've met. We've met. I know, Ruth. How are you?
Ah,
Good. Nice to see you, Randall.
See you again, too.
hello, everybody.
Hi, Ruth.
Hi,
Wie geht es,
Eva.
wie geht
Nice to
es Ihnen?
see you. Gut.
Schön. Haben Sie meine E-Mails in der letzten Zeit gekriegt?
Ja, der letzte Monat war sehr beschäftigt. Ich beantworte sie bald.
Ja, darum geht es nicht. Ich wollte nur hören, ob Sie es gekriegt haben.
Ja, ich habe es gekriegt. Danke.
Okay, alles andere ist okay.
There's Elspeth. Hello, Elspeth. Hi. Hello, everybody. Okay. Shall we start? Hello, Katerina. Okay, everybody. So let's start. Rashawn, you keep letting people in, and we're going to start with an embodied practice because this is embodied dialogues. And as a student of Gendlin's for so many years, and how he taught us about thinking at the edge, that we take concepts and we bring them into the body. And we check to see how the body, how the felt sense is carrying the concept. And this is a way for us to develop concepts and theories and the intellectual world while bringing in embodiment. An important part. What is that weird noise? Can everybody hear that?
Yeah.
Sounds like a little chipmunk chewing away on something. Okay. So just settling yourself in your chair. You might want to stand up. Some people really like to stand up when they feel into the body. And just beginning to notice what's happening for you today, right in this moment. And notice what part of your body you might be drawn to. And maybe you don't want to spend that much time down in the body. You might want to just notice something in the room around you, and that's all just fine. We're just wanting to slow the process down a little bit and gently say hello inside. So we're here with Dr. Ruth Lanius, and we're going to explore with Ruth her whole world around trauma research. And just notice how that sits for you in your body. Now, what's your relationship to research? And maybe you have a particular question for Ruth. Maybe that kind of relationship or intersection between the work that we do as trauma therapists and how we bring research into that is a kind of curious place for us to explore. And just noticing what happens as you invite your body to take this all in. We'll be together over the next hour in a really body-friendly place. can slowly bring your attention back to the room. So we have a big group today. We actually had 500 people sign up to hear you, Ruth. It's pretty cool. And there's almost 100 people here with us now. So I'm going to, in the beginning, spotlight you and I, and then we'll go back to the group. But it's kind of nice in the beginning to just be able to see each other a little bit more than the tiny little box, as we were saying before we got started. It's really different when you're in the room with somebody than when, yeah. So we're about, I guess, about 100 miles from each other. We're both in Canada, which is kind of nice. Let's see. So Ruth, you are a professor of psychiatry at Western University, right?
Yes. Now, I would say I'm really a clinician scientist. So, I still really work clinically, and all my research really comes from my patients, I would say.
Yeah, and that's lovely, right? Because it really gives you that you're really sitting at that intersection between being a practitioner and being a researcher. And I think these two worlds have been quite separate.
Absolutely. I think two separate, right? And I think you really have to understand the first person perspective of an individual who's suffering in order to research those difficulties, right?
So do you feel a little lonely in that role? Or do you have fellow colleagues that are straddling that at the same time?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have a wonderful team of individuals, and we're all working together in this mission to really marry clinical work and research. And then also, I have a number of colleagues who are trying to do the same thing. And so I think we have a really solid group of people who can support each other, which I think is also important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you're the director of the PTSD research unit. Well, I don't know, whatever they call that there. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a group of clinicians and researchers and clinician scientists, and we all have the common goal to really advance our understanding of trauma, especially the treatment of trauma, and really look at how trauma affects brain, mind, and body and soul, really.
Beautiful. So can you tell us a little bit about what's hot right now, what you're working on now that you're excited about, or you think, is it important for probably lots of us who aren't researchers?
Yeah, so one thing we're really trying to understand better is really the conscious and subconscious brain and how they interact. We know so much of trauma is not at a conscious level, right? When we get triggered in the aftermath of trauma, many times we have no idea what triggers us. And all of a sudden, our body, our autonomic nervous system is out of balance. We may feel pain. We may feel short of breath, right? We may feel tension. And, we might start getting really disoriented, but we don't know what's triggered us and what's really happening. And so I think that really centers around the subconscious part of the brain, which is very deep. It's the survival brain, the reptilian brain. It's the brain stem and the midbrain, so very deep in the brain. And of course, that has, very dense connections with the body. And that's very affected and often very dysregulated. That part of the brain directs different defensive responses, whether we have a fight or flight response or whether we shut down or freeze. That part of the brain also generates these raw emotions, right? These primal emotions that I think are so prominent in the aftermath of trauma, right? Raw rage, raw grief, raw sadness, raw shame, raw terror. And because that, those lower parts of the brain are connected to the rest of the brain, they can really hijack our thoughts, how we view ourselves and the world. And so I think the whole question is, how do we target those deep structures of the brain, right? That really can dysregulate our nervous system, that can, really generate those raw, very, very intense feelings that can really dysregulate us. And how can we calm that sort of subconscious part of the brain down to free the conscious part of the brain that really, interprets who we are in this world, how we see the world. And so I think that's a really important question in trauma, something that we're very excited about.
Yeah, for sure. It's speaking to what Steve Porges calls that intervening variable, right? It's like if
Absolutely.
you're in that kind of raw state, it's going to color everything. And I think we all have, experiences with clients who it's just so difficult for them to shift out of that, and they're living their lives like I have one right now, in very dangerous ways of this rageful activation, which they really understand, the root of it. But when they're in it, there's no awareness of that, right? They're just in it.
And I think the other thing is that often they need this intense kind of sensory input, this intense raw emotion, this intense arousal to feel anything, right? Because as we know from Janet, right, one of the biggest effects of trauma is that you lose the capacity to feel alive, right? And so many individuals, I think, not even consciously, again, subconsciously pick a fight, right, to bring online that intense rage. And that's the only time then they'll report feeling alive. Again, they don't know they're doing this. And this is something I ask much more often about now. When you get angry or rageful or really irritable, is that a time when you feel more alive than at other times?
Yeah.
And you ask that question, right? All of a sudden you decrease the shame for an individual. And, often the penny drops, they go, yes, you're right. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, and it makes sense in terms of this kind of trauma feedback loop, because if you're shifting from that intensity and then shutting down, that numb dorsal state, dead,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So shifting into rage
Yeah.
is a great way to feel alive again.
Yeah, exactly.
Or anxiety.
Yeah. But it's better for a lot of individuals than feeling nothing, right? Than feeling absolutely dead.
Yeah. And also, I guess, in talking with Steve about the dorsal state, well, in both states, he was so clear, you can't stay there forever.
No.
So in order to then shift out of that dissociated numbing state, if your body doesn't feel safe enough to go to ventral, you're going to go to flight fight, right?
Or you're going to go to drugs.
Yes, right? Addictive behaviors, yeah.
Or you're going to go to disorder, dysregulated eating, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because all of that I call them like propellers that shift you back and forth from one state to another.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad we're talking about this, because it's really the work that I'm doing around helping people to understand and appreciate addictions, their function, how they help you when there's no safety.
Exactly. And so I think that really decreases the shame, right?
Yeah.
So intense for individuals who suffer from addictions, right?
And then, Ruth, right, I wanted to ask you about this. So then what happens is, in that state, we're also, it's a primitive part of the brain, that we're not in our executive functioning, not in the prefrontal cortex. So we're doing and behaving in ways that violate social norms. They violate our own value system. And then we're shamed for that.
Exactly. Yeah. And often, we have no idea we're doing it and why we're doing it. Right?
So do you explain that overtly to clients?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm.
And people feel so validated. From day one, when we started studying the brains of individuals who'd been traumatized, they kept saying to us, oh my God, this is so validating. And, this is my brain. It's not me.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So often they were told, just get over it, just stop it, right? Because again, I think, the mental health care system, we've come a long way, but it's still thin in really the understanding of trauma, right? And the effects of trauma on
Yeah.
brain, mind, and
Very
soul.
apologizing, especially for women around this borderline personality thing. It's
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
We have a long way to go to really understand why an individual is presenting a certain way, right? And I think it's all about an adaptation,
Yes.
right? The brain, mind, and body adapt
Mhm.
to inescapable threat.
Mhm. To survive.
Yeah. And often it doesn't even know safety, right? Safety is a foreign concept.
Yeah.
And so actually coming to safety is not easy, right?
It can be really scary, right? Because you're
Yeah.
allowing this vulnerability.
Yeah.
But isn't it wonderful when our clients, when they give us that moment where you see that they start to engage and really feel into that with us, right?
Yeah.
Because they feel
Absolutely.
respected and
And
understand.
absolutely. And we have to dose it so carefully, right? Because,
Yes.
right, if it's too much, then it becomes overwhelming, right?
So very tender, gentle little steps. Yeah, this
And
is why I love focusing, because it's like that. It just tender, gentle little steps that titrate.
and I love the quote by Rick Clough, who says, the slower you go, the faster you get there, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's so true.
Yeah.
So tell us some more. You had written in your description something about the default mode network. Tell us about that. Is that kind of new or new-ish research that's coming out?
Yeah, I think it's certainly, at the forefront of the sense of self, right? And we think about a lot of trauma symptoms, right? We think about, concentration difficulties, flashbacks, nightmares, avoidance, numbing, too much arousal, too little arousal, right? Shame, guilt, anger, terror, fear. But I think what it all boils down to is that a lot of traumatized individuals actually lose the sense of who they are after trauma. Or if we're dealing with developmental trauma, they actually never form a coherent, whole sense of self, right? And so this sense of self, I think, is really at the core of trauma experiences. And I think it's something we don't measure enough, and it's something we don't think about enough.
Yeah.
And we have a brain network called the default mode network, and it's really connected when individuals are at rest, when they're not engaging in a particular task, when they're just kind of focused on the inside, just like we did at the beginning of this session, right? When we're engaged in introspection, when we're just, following the inside of what's happening inside us, this sense of self network becomes really active.
Hmm.
And this network is involved in, reflecting on what we're feeling. It's really involved in remembering life events. And it's a network that also helps us to connect with others, read other people's emotions, intentions, and feelings, right? So it's also a critical part of, what Steve would call the social engagement system.
Yeah.
And so what happens in the aftermath of trauma is that this network really becomes disconnected. And so just broadly speaking, the back of the network, helps us remember the past, and the front part of the network gives the past a context, right? So it gives it the context of the now, of the present. So we can know that we're in the present, and that we're recalling a past event.
That's crucial.
Absolutely. But as we know, in trauma, we lose that context.
Yes. Yeah.
And what we actually see is that this network becomes very disconnected, and only the back part of this network really is active.
Mm.
Right?
And how do you see that? How do you know that?
It's, if I showed you an image right now, the whole front part of this network would be missing. And so you're really stuck in the past without the context of the present.
Yeah, well, exactly.
And that's what trauma is all about, right? The past being ever present.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So tell us what you do to work with that.
Yes, I just want to add a second piece.
Okay.
Well, the only time this network seems to become somewhat connected is under threat. So when people are faced with reminders of their trauma, when they get that intense hyperarousal, that's the only time we see this network come online. So that's the only time we really see that they have this semblance of a sense of self.
Mm.
And when we first saw this, we were, really struck by these findings. And I invited a trauma survivor, to really get her sense of what she felt as she looked at these data.
Mm.
And she described eloquently how she engaged in regular stealing. And when she stole, she would get that intense hyperarousal. And that was the only time she felt her I, right, her sense of self would come online. And so again, that's the only time she felt alive, right? When we think about our earlier conversation, was under the intense, symptoms of hyperarousal. And so that made us think, the importance of this potentially also in engaging in abusive relationships, because again, we need this default mode network to engage with others, to socially connect with others. And so if the only time this comes online is under threat, is this what's perpetuating somebody being in a situation of domestic violence, being in a situation of being trafficked? Or is this maintaining the relationship with the perpetrator, which we often have to maintain if we're young? We're relying on the perpetrator for survival, right? Because
or what about if we are the perpetrator? That this
absolutely, absolutely.
So in both instances,
Both ways, yes, absolutely. And does that perpetuate the intergenerational transmission of trauma?
And then also look at what's paired there. What's paired is I feel alive, I have a sense of me, and what me is doing is hurting myself and or hurting others.
Yeah.
I mean, no wonder it's hard to heal.
Yeah. And I think for us as therapists, right, that's so hard if we have an individual who is in these abusive relationships over and over again, right? And we can't get them out. And I think this is one mechanism that we can help to understand, right? Why individuals keep doing this, right? It's so frustrating as a therapist and as a client, right? That you can't get out of this. But actually knowing that your brain is driving this, and one mechanism how this may be driven can then get us, of course, to treatments as well, right?
And then also for us as therapists, well, in the world, developing compassion for people that are perpetrating.
Yeah.
Through understanding that this is that same mechanism that they're caught in.
Yeah. And this is, I think, something that we really have to research. I think it's of critical importance, right?
Yeah. Fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't think we think enough about this loss of feeling alive, right?
Well, and maybe because this whole, Steve's naming the dorsal vagus was such a huge thing, because it really gave us another whole language and way of understanding dissociation, which we all knew about as trauma therapists, right? But but understanding it from a neurophysiological perspective gives it an oomph.
Exactly. And again, takes the shame out of it.
Oh,
Right? Decreases the shame, right? And again, this is at a subconscious level, as Steve often talks about, right? You don't choose this, right? The brain, the lower part of the brain, the survival brain, the reptilian brain reacts without thinking because that's what fosters survival, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Putting addictions into that light just adds another whole layer, because I think, it's hard to think of things other than addiction that are as shamed in our culture, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Especially around sex and food. That's a big one. Alcohol is, that's a problem, but it's much more normalized.
Yeah.
But things like sex and food, which are early shaped addictions, right? You're working with folks with sex and food addiction. It's a little trickier now with sex addiction because it's become such a huge problem with the pornography.
Yeah.
But, if you see this early on in people in, young ages, because these behaviors they're accessible.
Yeah.
And they work.
Yeah. In the short term, right?
In the short term. Yeah.
Yeah. And hard drugs, right?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're sure on the same page.
Yeah.
So nice. I'm just wishing I could come and be part of your group.
You can visit anytime, Jen.
I'd love to come and visit.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh,
Anytime.
I'm going to take you up on that.
Right.
I just think it's so important what you're doing and getting that message out there. Because I think a lot of therapists too are intimidated by the research world.
Yes. And something we really have to keep working on, and we're currently writing a book actually trying to translate all our research into, lay language. And it's not easy, but this is something I think we really need, right? So individuals can understand.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, I can see people are saying in the chat, when do we get a chance to ask questions? Right now. Okay, so I'm going to stop spotlighting us and bring us back to the group. Roshan, I can't even find myself here. There's so many people. Can you stop spotlighting me? Oh, wait. Here I go back to gallery. There we go. All right. Well, Ruth, got lots of questions already.
Great.
Liz, hello.
Hi, thank you. This is wonderful. I was at the Andrea conference last August when Ruth gave the presentation. That was just so encouraging. My question is around the consciousness and unconsciousness. Jen, you asked what else is more stigmatized, carries more stigma than addiction, but I see the schizophrenia, psychotic symptoms, hallucinations.
Absolutely.
I've had the rare opportunity to work with a kid had severe psychotic symptoms after a traumatic instance. But what I want to pick your brain on my clinical conceptualization of the psychotic symptom. It just becomes it's almost like a nightmare that broke the barrier of sleep awake. It just carried on even when the person is awake. So I'm an EMDR therapist, so we just targeted the psychotic material, even though it's all bizarre content, but the emotions and sensations would have been very appropriate to all that traumatic incident, the trauma.
Yeah.
So what yeah, just what do you see, or what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a great question and it's a complicated question. And I think we have to keep in mind that we can have actual psychosis and trauma overlapping. But I think it's also important to realize that some of the psychotic symptoms can be related to trauma. And, we know, for example, prevalence of voice hearing is equally prevalent in dissociation and associated with early life trauma as it is in schizophrenia. Now, Liz, you briefly mentioned that your patient had quite bizarre thinking. And again, I don't know this patient, but often when there's really bizarre thinking, that tends to be more psychotic-like. But again, I don't know the details. But I think it's important to remember that we can have voice hearing, we can have pseudopsychotic symptoms, that are very prevalent in the aftermath of trauma. And we actually understand the brain mechanism of this a little bit. One of the most consistent findings that we see when individuals dissociate is altered activation in the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe, altered activation in the temporal lobe is also very much associated with temporal lobe epilepsy-like symptoms. And, these are strange pseudopsychotic symptoms that are very common in the aftermath of trauma. And so I think it's really important to tease apart, is this due to dissociation, early life trauma? Is this due to psychosis? Or are we seeing both? And I think it's important to normalize for patients, right, that voice hearing and these pseudopsychotic symptoms are really common in the aftermath of trauma and dissociation. So we normalize it a little bit, because every time we ask, right, patients don't want to disclose it because they're worried that we'll think they're crazy, right?
That's so important. Wow. Yeah. Okay, Elspeth. Hello, Elspeth.
Hi, Elspeth.
You're muted. Can you unmute yourself? Can you unmute? There we
Thank
go.
you, Jen, and thank you, Ruth. I work with people with developmental disabilities, and the people that I get referred are individuals who don't have verbal language, and they're usually referred because of behaviours that challenge, very severe, distressing behaviours for everyone, them as well. So I'm wondering whether in the work that you're doing, whether there's the opportunity maybe to be more able to diagnose, because they're a very traumatized population with ACE scores higher than the general population. So we know there's trauma there, but it's not recognized, not identified, and it's not part of interventions. Instead, it tends to be restraint or chemical interventions. So I'm wondering whether the research you're doing right now might allow us to make better assessments, and therefore it can become more recognized, and we can provide interventions, more appropriate interventions. So it's really the assessment and getting it recognized that I'm wondering whether the work you're doing might provide opportunity to do that.
That's a great question, Elspeth. Thank you for bringing it up. And one thing our group is really working on is how trauma affects how we process the senses. And, sensory processing, I think, is really affected in trauma. And we really see trauma as an insult to the senses, right? And so many traumatized individuals have these incoming unsafe sensations that are associated with trauma. And when the brain, and again, they enter at the level of the brainstem, so very low in the brain. So you have these sensory signals coming from the body, right? The vagus nerve is one, but there's many other nerves that carry that information as well. And then you have the external senses, right, also coming into the brainstem. And if those senses are deemed unsafe, the brain gets into a pattern of thinking, of reacting without thinking. And you're staying very much at the lower brain. And of course, when you've been traumatized, many senses get then interpreted as unsafe, right? The world becomes unsafe. The inner world of our body, but also the outer world becomes often perceived as unsafe many times. And so the brain stays in this perpetual state of reacting without thinking. And I think that really decreases the involvement of the higher part of the brain, the cortex, that's critical for embodiment, a sense of agency, right? Thinking, planning, language, curiosity, connection, and emotion regulation, right? And it all becomes about survival, reacting without thinking. And so, especially in developmentally affected individuals, we need to, I think, intervene at the sensory level. As we talked about before, Jan, we need to really introduce the brain to safe sensory input, right? So it can learn, what safety is and really then adapt to a safe environment. Does that make any sense, Elspeth?
Absolutely. That's a wow response, because you've taken it much further than I could even have thought of that. That's amazing, actually. I'll maybe connect with you more.
You and
Sure.
I are to come and visit Ruth. Elsbeth's in Toronto as well.
Oh, you're in
Ruth,
Toronto as well. Yes,
can we come and visit you?
absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Love the networking. Tharsini, is that how you say your name?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. I'm in Toronto too, so I can join you guys when you visit.
Okay,
Absolutely.
anybody
I'm
else?
personally.
So I think I really love your response to Elizabeth's question. My question was along the same line for developmental disabilities, because as you said earlier, Ruth, people with trauma, so in the default network, they have challenges in the front part of it, as in like bringing the past and bringing it to the front and contextualizing the trauma. They're stuck sort of in the past trauma experience, if I
Yeah.
understand correctly. But my daughter has autism, and I've seen children with autism, they're kind of more present. They have difficulty bringing like other people's states, memory from other people's, whatever or your previous experiences, and bringing that into the present moment so you can effectively contextualize and make decisions. So and I think, as you said, we as caregivers and people around them, I think the best way to sort of support these individuals, the people around them need to become more aware of internal and external safety.
Yeah.
And like you said, slowly dose the safety experiences for them to feel more safe, as you said. Just wondering how, in your experience, how can we best develop the sense of self for people with developmental disabilities? Because the concept of languages may be missing, the cognitive parts are missing. So how do you think is the best way to sort of address default mode and network level challenges for children with developmental disabilities?
I think through co-regulation, right? Again, it needs to be dosed. But, I think co-regulation has a profound ability to introduce the individual to safe sensations, right? And then really calm that low part of the brain and allow the upper part of the brain to come online as soon as it feels safer. And then I think that really propagates that sense of connection that those individuals can then experience. Does that make sense, Tarsini?
Yes, thank you. I think yes. And I think the challenge, thank you. Yes, definitely.
But the challenge is, somebody who's autistic, of course, has difficulty connecting, right?
Yeah.
But I think even, connecting at that subliminal level, right, is sometimes all we can do and can foster safety to allow that part of the brain to relax and feel safe.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question in the chat from Jennifer. Doesn't there also need to be a top-down cognitive process of safe thinking to soothe the body, in addition to bottom-up safe sensory experiences?
Great question. And again, I think our thoughts are very much influenced by our raw emotions and those raw sensations that come into our brain from the body and from the environment. And as soon as you're able to soothe that part of the brain, your thoughts change, and you're freed from some of the very negative thinking, like I'm horrible, I'm a disgusting person, I'm unsafe, I will never be safe again, the world is an unsafe place. And I think once you've worked with that lower part of the brain, especially in the more severely ill patients, that really opens the avenue for working then with thoughts and making meaning. Because I always give this example, so many of our patients come in, right, and they say, I know this wasn't my fault really, but I can't stop feeling it, right? And so we're trying to get at these low, raw level feelings and that raw arousal dysregulation. And once we've been able to calm that, then working with the thoughts is a completely different story. And I think much more effective.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of talking about the role of CBT in trauma. It makes a lot of sense when the brain and the nervous system is in a state that's able to receive that way of shifting thinking.
Absolutely. And I think our job in the field is to bring these bottom-up and top-down treatments together, right? So they both function optimally.
Yes, and this is why I love Jenlyn's work too, because, in felt sensing, people think it's just about sensation, and this is just so wrong. Felt sensing is about thinking and feeling and physical sensations and memories in the body. It's about the whole body, a lot of which we spend time thinking, which is wonderful.
Exactly, right? And if our sensations are only unsafe, we can't think, right? And if we make them safe, all of a sudden our thinking and our capacity for higher connection comes online, right?
And yet this is so frustrating too, because so many of the programs that are funded, you saw with after COVID in Canada anyway, I think in the States too, are all CBT based.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with CBT. It's so important. It's interweaving these bottom-up and top-down approaches. Right?
Exactly. Okay, who was next? I think Jane was next. Jane Miller. Hello, Jane.
Hi. What a wonderful experience. And I just want to say, Ruth, your years of wisdom have had such a huge impact on my practice. So I'm grateful to you every day. So thank you. I've been in private practice for over 30 years, and I specialize in working with trauma survivors. And one of the things that I find so fascinating is the intertwining of so many different complementary healing modalities that I've been practicing for my life. And specifically, I've just in the past 2 days had major breakthroughs using somatic practices. And I just want to share that the opening that happens when you get inside your body and really can speak to your body and ask what it needs. And boy, just how amazingly the person looks to me like, what are you talking about? And immediately their body tells them what it needs. And it's so magical to see this breakthrough. So I want to thank you for that. My question is this. I've had 2 clients in the last 2 days bring up TikTok. And it's terrifying. I don't go to TikTok. But the information they're getting is so unprofessional. And I have clients that are saying, I think I have BPD. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Why would you say that? Where is that coming from? And then they're reading it from TikTok. Or they're reading about how medication is the worst thing you can do to yourself. And so I'm wondering, is there some way we can all together come together as a group to somehow get on TikTok and kind of do some education? Because it's really frightening to see the impact it's having on my clients and other people's clients. That's just my question for you. Thank you.
And not an easy question, right? I mean, social media has great advantages and it has great disadvantages, right? And so many of our clients are also traumatized on social media, right? The bullying, I mean, it's so hard for so many individuals. And I think we're also in an identity crisis, right? Especially some of the younger people, right? They're drawn to these groups because that gives them a feeling of belonging. And some of these groups, you know, make them think sometimes they have a certain diagnosis that they may not necessarily have. They may or they may not, right? But it gives them a sense of belonging. So I think we really, as a society, need to deal with this identity crisis that individuals are facing, right? And how can we give people a sense of belonging, a sense of connection, where you don't need to have a diagnosis, right? Where you can feel accepted and have the sense of belonging without that. And how do we distribute more appropriate, information? Again, I think that's something very important we need to think about as a field, right? So I think there's many difficulties going on, and yeah, that need to be overcome.
Tricky.
Thank you.
Neil.
Stay well.
Hi, Neil.
Yes. Hi. I too work with developmental challenges. I work with in early intervention with children who often are misdiagnosed as being on the spectrum. My question to you is that the titration of safety. So I focus on deepening reciprocal attachment and attunement through co-regulation, slowing down, meeting the child, whatever they're doing, even in states of unsafety, because those states of unsafety, when met and reflected and held, then interoceptively becomes a safe place. Then often when intentionally disrupting that sense of connection, I find that in the co-repair, that titration of safety, then the breaking of the connection, it's in that co-repair that that ventral state becomes even more resilient. So my question is, the alteration between safety and then going back and allowing a patient to then go into a disruptive state and allowing that, does that then strengthen in your research the overall sense of safety? Because to alternate between both states is necessary, rather than to hold too long the titration in a particular in a particular state.
Very interesting, Neil. Thanks. Yeah, I think certainly, right, rupture and then repair, as Alan Shore often talks about it, right? The repair after a rupture has taken place can be profoundly facilitating that co-regulation and trust, right? And really, facilitate those inputs of safety. And I think we really need to think about, when we introduce the rupture and repair, right? At what stage in the treatment, right? How much trust do we and safety do we need to establish first before introducing that? And I think that's going to be different for different individuals, right? But we've all seen how rupture and repair, right?
I guess what I'm saying then, it's safe to go back for that individual in a disruptive state. I can revisit, and we're talking about any age, that state of alarm.
That's what you mean, yeah.
I bring to it something else, and I can because I was there in safety, and now I could re-experience with a greater sense of curiosity and trust the unsafe state.
Yeah.
The high sympathetic arousal state.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing that.
Kind of developing the titration, right? So in focusing, we would call that blending. So you could blend a felt sense of being ventrally grounded and then go back into that scary rupturous place with the blending of the grounding in the body of ventral at the same time. And then slowly it kind of integrates and moves on into the whole self. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like peekaboo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, who else have we got? More questions? Elspeth, I bet you could say more.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, really. I'd like to get, I guess, a better sense, Ruth, of, can you tell us, describe for us a little bit, like, what does the research actually look like? Like, how do you look into the brain? And how do you find those findings? If I came to see you, what would I see if you were in the middle of doing some research?
Yeah, so it depends on the research. A lot of our studies now look at brain, mind, and body before treatment. Then we do a treatment, and then we look at brain, mind, and body again after treatment. And so, we do a very thorough assessment where we really get the first person experience of the individual. And we get some biological measures, we get some brain measures, and the way we measure the brain is through functional magnetic resonance imaging. And it involves, going into a scanner, and, it allows us to visualize the brain both anatomically, but also what we're really interested in is functionally, right? So how does the brain function? How active is it? How connected is it? And we can then look at that before and after treatment. And we always couple this with the first person experience, because that can profoundly affect brain activation. So I think it's really important to couple it. And then we also have body measurements, for example, of the autonomic nervous system, right? And so we can really couple what happens in the brain, in the body, and in terms of the first person experience.
I remember your study in Bessel's book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? I think this was your study with Stan and Uta.
Yeah, yeah.
I still use that when I teach, because it's so cool the way the brain, the image, what it looks like is so different with Stan and dorsal, I think, and Uta or whatever it was, and sympathetic. It's
And
really,
if we hadn't had their first person experience, we would have lost all that. Right?
yeah. Do people know this study? It's in, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score. Very interesting. Yeah. Elspeth, did you put your hand up again? Oh, you're muted again.
Yes, I did. I do have another question, if I may. And
Sure.
Ruth, I used to be involved in quite heavy duty neurobiological research, and then I went into medicine and did clinical practice. But as I get more into, for example, Grenland's felt sense, things shift again. So my question to you really is, do you have a different mindset for your research, for your clinical practice, and for your more kind of felt sense experience? Or do you prepare for each of those separately in some manner in order to get into those mindsets? Or are you totally fluid across all 3 or 4, even 5 different ways of being and thinking?
I think there's a fluidity. And I think bringing the felt sense to the research is very important as well. And so, yeah, I think there's a fluidity across the different states or modalities. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Interesting question.
Yeah. Okay, we've got one in the chat. Please address prevention of the client creating false memories to justify a subconscious feeling emerging.
Interesting question. False memory being, can you give an example?
Tom, are you with us? Can you give an example of a false memory? Tom Shoemaker. Maybe he's gone now.
Yeah, so, I'm no judge of whether something is actually happened or didn't happen. I work with an individual who is distressed by something. And so if they're distressed by something, we work on regulating their nervous system to feel more regulated. Whether that's true or not, you know, that's not for me to decide, right? My job is to get the person to feel more regulated and really increase that window of tolerance, which will then allow them to function better and to connect better with others. Does that make sense?
Tom is saying an example would be blaming a parent for abuse.
And how would that, so because they're feeling distressed, now they're turning and blaming someone.
And maybe it's not true.
You know, I might say to them, I wonder what your parent experienced that, you know, made them react in a certain way. Can we reflect on that? You know, do you think this was a malicious act, or do you think this was more an act out of desperation?
That's interesting. You're kind of reframing it as you're working with it in that way.
And so again, it's up to the person to feel what they feel about this relationship, right? I don't know, I wasn't there, right?
Okay. Anna.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd have a question regarding early attachment trauma. I work with a lot of adoptees. So you naming how that early experience of not having connection creates the sense of not having a self. And also with the title of this, like reclaiming the hijacked self, and in some sense not having gotten to really create a sense of self, the sense of self gets sort of hijacked by feeling like there's a black hole. Just curious in what ways, from your research perspective, you might talk about that to help people with that lost sense of self to sort of start reclaiming a sense of self. Do I make myself clear? My English today is not the best.
No, absolutely.
Okay.
And I think a lot of this is nonverbal too, right? And so often I use artwork, doing a collage, drawing how they perceive themselves. And I often give the metaphor of, you know, we're allowing the butterfly to emerge from the larva, right? And it's going to take time. It's a natural process. It takes longer or it takes shorter for some people. But the key thing is not to mess with the larva. You can't speed this up. You can't slow it down. It's just going to happen. So I often say, don't mess with the larva and allow the butterfly to emerge. And then, yeah, when somebody's ready, not everybody is ready. I use a lot of artwork. You know, a lot of my patients are very talented and they love to express themselves in the form of artwork or doing a collage, so they can actually see the changes in their sense of self.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we're coming to the end. This was really wonderful, Ruth. Thank you.
It's great conversation and great questions.
Yeah.
So much for all the work you do, right?
Yeah, it's a wonderful group. We're really building. It really is. The people are amazing. It's so rich. It's just so exciting. So yes, look forward to Elspeth and I, and Tharsani will be coming to visit you. Maybe
Excellent.
not no, but in April.
Yeah, absolutely.
All
I look
right.
forward to it.
Anybody else that's close by that would like to join us, please let us know. So thank you so much, Ruth. Really, it was just wonderful. I love your presence, and I really think that presence is everything. It's the most important thing, what we do, that we can be with people with such deep respect.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jan. It was a real honor to be with all of you.
Okay, so next time is C. Sykes. Do you know C, Ruth?
No.
She's worked with Dick Schwartz for a long time in the beginning. She's an IFS practitioner. She wrote a book about addiction, so it should be really great. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Stay warm, and we really appreciate you coming and showing up and being with us.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.